All right, let's get started here. Hello, hi to everyone who's joined us this morning. I'm Sam Sussman, Director of Extend. It's great to see so many friends of Extend on the call here. Just a quick word of housekeeping before I introduce our guest and we get going. So on previous calls, we did everyone in a video chat, and that worked well for the size of those calls. Today, we've got almost 100 people registered to hear from our great guest, Sam Bahour. So we decided instead to go to a webinar format where the video will just be on Sam and myself. And that's just to give Sam the time and attention that he warrants. And there is a Q&A feature. So you can type into the chat bar here. For those, I'm sure many of us are familiar now with how all these Zoom features work. A little more than 2 months ago. So you can type a question into the chat here. I'll make sure that everyone's questions get to Sam and that folks get answers on the questions that are on their mind. And it's great to see so many friends keep typing in here. So just a quick word for those who are joining and are not familiar with Extend. Extend brings young American Jews to Israel and Palestine to meet with civil society, political and human rights activists who are working against the occupation. Since the beginning of that work, Sam Bahour has been a crucial partner, as he has been to so many other organizations doing similar work. Sam is a renowned activist, entrepreneur, policy advisor, and writer. His accomplishments almost defy being listed in a brief introduction. Co-founder of Paltel, director of the Arab Islamic Bank, advisor, board member of the Open Society's MENA office, co-founder of Americans for Vibrant Palestinian Economy, board member of Just Vision, board member at the Palestinian Policy Network, secretariat member of the Palestine Strategy Group, and a frequent writer, including co-editor of Homeland, Oral History of Palestine and Palestinians. As I've gotten to know Sam over the years, it's been so clear to me, as it has been to many, many others, just how unique a role Sam plays as an American Palestinian in Ramallah, building bridges between American audiences and Palestinian realities. And I think we can all agree that that work has never been more important than it is now, with the Trump administration greenlighting the Netanyahu government's annexation of portions of the West Bank and so many of the frameworks that we've all worked within now in question. So it's a perfect time to hear from Sam. I'm very grateful to him for joining us and to so many people for joining the call. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our guest today, Sam Bahour.
Thank you, Sam, for that great introduction, and a pleasure to have everyone online. Hopefully everyone is healthy and dealing with all the issues facing us. Seems like in the US, COVID may be not the first on the list these days. What I'd like to do is to share my screen, those famous words that have been said 2 million times in the last 2 months. I have a very, you just need to give me the ability to enable to share my screen, Sam. I have just a short presentation I'd like to do. I usually don't do PowerPoints, but I actually decided to do one because there's so many moving parts right now that I felt that maps are needed as well to be able to envision what people are talking about when they talk about annexation. So we'll give Sam a second to give me the ability to share my screen. Actually, I'm not sure how.
Okay, give me a second and I'll figure this out.
As we're waiting, I'd just like to make a note that I do have a new article coming out today regarding an Israeli military order that was issued directly addressing the banks in Palestine. And that will be on Monday Weiss in a couple of hours, I assume. Maybe you can go out with the follow-up to this presentation.
Apologies, we'll have it in a second.
Should have actually tested that with you first.
There we go.
There
okay,
we go.
Great. Apologies for that.
Let me just share this with you. Tell me if you can see my presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
It's visible now.
All right, what I'd like to start with is the title, because I called this Another Israeli Occupation version 2020 for a reason. This is not the first time that we're facing Israeli annexation, and I hope that becomes clear throughout the presentation. So I want to start with a line from the Charter of the United Nations. And the reason I bring this forward is if there was not rules in this world, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because annexation would be an act of the mighty, and the weak are just out of luck. Luckily, our world doesn't work like that. And this specific part of the United Nations Charter actually says all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of threat against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Remember, Palestine today is a state in the United Nations, but even if it wasn't, it says, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. That's a pretty powerful statement. And I think that implanting that in our minds as we think through annexation gives us a reference point, which I think is needed. Otherwise, everything becomes an opinion. And if you put in Google your opinion, you're bound to find 5,400,673 people who agree with you, but that still doesn't mean it's right. So what is annexation? Annexation is the acquisition of territory through force, in the short definition of it. As I said, this is not the first act of Israeli annexation. And I listed a couple different tools that Israel has used that can be classified as annexation. The first is war. And that's a topic for a different discussion. But in 1948, when Israel was created, it was created by an act of military force. And it, by no stretch of the imagination, was even close to the borders that were designated within the 1947 partition plan, which was a 56-43 split. When that war was over in 1948, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine, and we'll come to that later. The West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, the remaining part was 22%. Jerusalem was actually identified as a international corpus separatum, and that's why those two numbers don't add up to 100. Israel also, over history, many times, daily actually, uses the tool of planning to annex. And there's many examples I can give. The one I pulled out was the 1967-68 Alone Plan, which was an Israeli plan that proposed at that time to annex about half of the West Bank, going down the center of the West Bank horizontally. And that included the Jordan Valley and more lands to be allocated to the state of Israel through annexation. Israel also uses the tool of law, its own law, and the prime example related to our topic today is the 1967 annexation by the military force of Jerusalem. And then in 1980, Israel actually declared annexed the East Jerusalem part. And as we know, in 2017, the USA by Trump comes and gives a confirmation of Israel for their recognizing Israel as Jerusalem's united capital, both East and West. And that's significant because when the superpower accepts an illegal act of annexation, there's a possibility that it can stick. And there's many examples in history where annexed lands become controversial until a time where the powers to be actually force them through history. And then we have the ongoing occupation. Let's not forget, this is not about annexation in a nutshell. This is not a vacuum. This is coming within 53 years of a military occupation. And there's been many tools that Israel continues to use, which I would call annexation or getting to annexation, which is the building of the settlement enterprise. Today you have close to 700,000 Israeli settlers. That means Israeli citizens who have been relocated inside the West Bank. You have the separation barrier. You have retroactive laws in the Israeli system, which actually legalize settlements retroactively. And you have a lot of decisions that Israel has been taking to reorient to their court systems, which reflects annexation in the legal system. And we'll get to a couple of these later. My point here is that there's no sane person that can claim such an act, the acquisition of territory through force, is a legal act. We can have all kinds of discussions about the land and who has rights to the land. But once you, by force, take the land and make it yours, you are beyond argument and discussion and in an illegal realm. On the right-hand side, this map, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to show, because in 2016, actually in January, the Palestine Liberation Organization's Negotiations Unit, it's sometimes called the Negotiations Affairs Department or the Negotiations Support Unit, they produced this map, which is of the Jordan Valley. And if you look at the map closely, it may be too small to see on your screen, but the yellow area towards the bottom where it says Jericho, that's where Palestinians live. The green areas are where there is cultivation for the Palestinian side. And then you have these gray areas, if you note them, they have all been designated by the Israeli military as nature reserves. A beautiful, nice topic, nature. Who would want to destroy nature? Israel has historically used the classification of lands as nature reserves to create buffers so no one can actually touch them unless Israel decides to build a settlement on them, and then the nature reserve becomes an irrelevant designation. If you look at this map, again, the Jordan Valley alone, this is basically a map that, if you look behind the text of this slide, is the map that Netanyahu has been promoting for the last couple years, saying annexation of the Jordan Valley is doable, and he showed how to do it in a map. So this map is reflecting basically the same map that he's showing in that presentation there. Again, theme here is annexation is not new, sadly. Did annexation wake you up? If it has, then with all due respect, you have not been paying attention. And I'm pointing here to three examples, which I call either annexation or creeping annexation. The three that I wanted to point out, there was a law that was passed in the Knesset in Israel in 2018, the nation state law it's called, and it basically says the Jewish population is the only population and they have exclusivity for self-determination in Eretz Israel, which is being assumed between the sea and the river. Actually, Eretz Israel has many definitions. It can actually go further to the Mesopotamia and Iraq. But the idea here is that there's an exclusivity of Jewish self-determination here on all the land. That's annexation by law, by Israeli law, that is. And then there is another act of legal decision in 2018 where the Knesset made an amendment to its laws which shift many cases, mainly land-oriented cases, that used to go from the Palestinian complainant to the Israeli Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, the High Court in Israel, would legislate those cases or would try those cases. The Israeli Knesset, with this right-wing shift that it has in it, changed those procedures to take a lot of cases and say, you don't go to the Supreme Court immediately. You come to the Administrative Affairs Court in Jerusalem. The settlers applauded this amendment. They were actually behind it because they see it as giving them time to be able to deal with issues. Because if you go straight to the Supreme Court, supposedly the Supreme Court decision is final. But if you have to go through all the decision-making of all the different court systems, you basically have time to create more facts on the ground. And then the last one I wanted to point out, which is also a recent one, in 2017, Israel passed something called the Judea and Samaria Settlement Regulation Law. And that's basically retroactively legalizing, in the Israeli context, settlements. Some of those settlements even assume that they are on private Palestinian property. So all of this together and so much more is annexation in action. What we're seeing today is only the announcement, basically, of something that has been ongoing. From the Palestinian side, we were not surprised at all. And I don't say this slightly because although the graphic there is supposed to make you smile, there's nothing to smile about on this page. If we start with 1948 and the dispossession of Palestinians, the creation of the refugee community, structural discrimination that happens today inside Israel, 18 years of martial law, 53 years of military occupation, 700,000 settlers, a separation barrier, 700 plus UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, 43 US vetoes, 26 years of a peace process that only led to 5 times more settlers on the ground, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. With all of this, and we can discuss all of them because some of them may be controversial in terms of why these things are happening, but the bottom line is the Palestinians are still standing after all of this. Does anyone truly and honestly believe that we are going to collapse under the pressure of Jared Kushner? I don't think so. So what are the implications of another annexation? And again, I want to note something here. The act of annexation, the actual announcement of an annexation itself, per se is not rocking the boat, because as you can see, we've become very known. It's become very known that Israel's heading towards this point. But what is significant in 2020 is that annexation today represents the acceptance of might is right politics. Stronger party wins, too bad, everybody else go home. That's not how the world works today. And if this is allowed to pass unchallenged, basically the world is saying, let's forget diplomacy, let's forget politics. Everybody sharpen your knives and polish your weapons because you have to become strong to be able to gain your rights. That's a dangerous world to live in. Annexation today also represents an end to a negotiated solution between Palestinians and Israelis. We've seen this actually a long time ago. Oslo started the Oslo Peace Accords, the Oslo Accords. They weren't called the Peace Accords for a reason. They didn't reach peace. But the Oslo Accords actually started in 1993. All the way till today, we've been seeing a deterioration, especially after the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist. And Netanyahu was elected after that, and things have gone south ever since. But this is a clear last bullet in the Oslo Accords, which were meant to actually negotiate a solution between the two sides. And related to that is, it's also killing a paradigm of resolving this conflict within a two-state paradigm. Under the guise of Trump and his peace to prosperity vision, I say Trump, but I mean Trump in the USA. Whether we like it or not, Trump is representing the United States. So we cannot blame Trump alone for this entire fiasco that has been put upon us. This is an accumulation of many, many years of US politics. And he's the one who's actually adding his chunk of spoiled politics to bring it forward. But closing the two-state solution is very meaningful in terms of what options are left going forward. And maybe one of the most significant acts, one of the most significant fallouts of annexation is that Netanyahu and the Israeli government, this joint Israeli unity government, will be condemning another generation of Palestinians and Israelis to perpetual conflict. That can't be good for anybody. And that's why I think we need to put our foot down and say, this has to stop. Secondly, the impact of annexation on Palestinians per se. Again, it depends on the actual extent of the annexation. There's many different scenarios that are being talked about. Everything from just passing it into Knesset as a piece of paper, all the way to actually annexing 30% of the West Bank or more, and applying Israeli sovereignty to those pieces of land. It seems like we're going towards the 30% side of things. Today, Netanyahu, or last night, I think Netanyahu announced that the Palestinians that happen to fall in the areas that Israel will annex will not be given Israeli citizenship. They will be subjects in his terms. What does that mean for us? First and foremost, and there's a reason why I put it in red here, is there is a loss of hope. That is significant. Why? All the other things that I'm going to speak about, political, economic, security cooperation, we can analyze, measure, predict. Those are issues under our control in a way. Loss of hope is not. And this act of annexation comes on a continuum of loss of hope that has been happening ever since the start of the Oslo process. This will break the camel's back. And how loss of hope translates to daily reality is anybody's guess. On the political front, for Palestinians, it's not all negative. As Israel goes closer to annexation, it is forcing the Palestinian internal divisions to be mended. So there may be a Fatah-Hamas reconciliation because of this annexation. The younger generation, and those of you who have come on trips with Sam before know, are already and have been talking about the loss of a two-state solution, basically because of the settlement enterprise, making it almost impossible to implement on the ground, and have been calling for one state between the river and the sea with equal rights for everyone. That will increase. And there's also increasing calls, I'm one of these people, who are calling for the revoking of the PLO recognition of Israel. That's very different than saying Israel does not exist. It exists, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But politically, we recognize the state of Israel. Palestinians recognize the state of Israel as a prerequisite to entering into the Oslo Accords. Israel, until today, refuses to recognize the state of Palestine. At best, in the beginning of the Oslo process, they recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians. So if after 25 years, Israel still cannot come to give us equal recognition, then I don't see any reason we should maintain our recognition politically, especially because the recognition now is going to have annexed land, more annexed land as part of the definition of Israel in their minds. Economically, financial and business feasibility here is seriously threatened. I work in the private sector, and if you add annexation and threats of annexation to the COVID reality that we're all facing around the world, add additionally that this is all happening in Palestine on a foundation of 53 years of military occupation, the private sector here and those trying to build an economy are under extreme, extreme distress. The Palestinian breadbasket is lost if this annexation does take the Jordan Valley. That is our breadbasket. That's where the majority of our food comes from. And depending again on the extent of all of this, we will be losing more and more natural resources. Just so you're aware, it's not only land and water, but the areas that were identified in the Oslo process as areas C, under full Israeli control, 62% of the West Bank that is, in those areas which are under Israeli control, there are the Palestinian quarries, stone and marble quarries, which is the largest economic sector here. So with Israel threatening to annex parts of the area C, which is under its control in the West Bank, or was, it is actually threatening to dismember the entire stone and marble industry from the Palestinian economy. And then lastly, security cooperation has been a major issue because part of the Oslo package was a component called security cooperation. That security cooperation had two components to it. One was Palestinian-Israeli cooperation. That is about to collapse. The Palestinian leadership already announced that they have absolved themselves from all of the agreements because of this Israeli move, which will result in more human rights abuses. Basically, without Palestinians being in the picture, Israel will have a free hand. It kind of already does, and this is in progress. We don't know the extent of it yet. The other part of the security cooperation is Palestinian-USA cooperation, and that has collapsed. The Palestinians informed, actually the CIA, shockingly, and that was the final channel that was open between the Palestinians and the US ever since Trump closed the PLO office in Washington. We're being told that it's done, that it's been severed, that relationship. I put a question mark. I don't know how much truth there is to a full severing of that, but we'll see in the days to come. And thirdly, the possibilities of going forward. What can happen if the annexation takes place? I think there'll be a lot of condemnations, especially from the EU. There'll be little action if history is anything as a lesson to us. And ultimately, the slow process of the Palestinian struggle continuing in all of its forms, diplomatically, politically, economically, on the ground activities. All of that will happen. In addition, and this is something positive, that finally many more states in the international community will recognize that Israel has and never had probably any intention whatsoever to allow a Palestinian state to emerge. Thus, more states will bilaterally recognize Palestine. Already we have 140 states out of 193, I think, or 4. They've already recognized Palestine. Those few remaining states that have not will probably come forward, mainly probably from the EU side. There could be third-party mediation. The Palestinians have already said we will not accept mediation by the US alone. The US already proved that when it monopolized a 25-year process called Oslo, it failed utterly. So to restart the negotiations, what's being spoken about these days is the Quartet, which is a UN assembly of the EU, Russia, the USA, and the UN. And they're trying to bring the parties back to a table before this annexation takes place. Interestingly, the US administration has informed the Quartet, as we're being told, that will come under one condition, that the Palestinians submit a counter offer to what's wrong with the Trump plan. But we will not start discussions on any other parameter. That's a stillborn start, basically. There could be pressure coming from Jordan and or Egypt and or the EU separately, not to annex, or maybe not to annex right now because things are so sensitive. There could be, and this is very possible, a couple minutes before I joined the call, there was a killing in the West Bank. A soldier killed a Palestinian driver saying that he was going to do something wrong. Civil disobedience, full-scale civil disobedience, Intifada 1 style, could happen. And no matter what anybody tells you from the Israeli side or from the Palestinian side, I would claim nobody can limit that to nonviolence, as much as I would personally like to see it remain nonviolent. Of course, we can see a US reversal. That's unlikely, given what Biden has been saying, Biden's campaign has been saying already. But even if a new president came to the US and had the intention of basically holding Israel accountable, they would face a larger hurdle, which is Congress. Because Congress legislated itself in a corner long ago. Actually, during the Clinton administration, the pro-Israeli lobby kind of took out an insurance policy by passing a lot of legislation that basically handcuffed the executive branch so they can't act in this foreign affairs issue as they should. We could see an Israeli reversal. That's last on the list because it's highly unlikely. Both coalition parties, both Gantz and Netanyahu, agree on annexation. They're just bickering about timing. And that's something to keep in mind. We should also note, though, so we don't go to the extremes very quickly, is that Bibi Netanyahu's bark has historically always been louder than his bite. So although there's a lot of fanfare about he's going to annex starting in July, I'll wait and see exactly what the act is. But I do think they will do something. So I want to end by just a couple slides to put all of this in context. Like I mentioned, this is not happening in a vacuum. All of these different topics that we can talk about, and we should, they all lead to the same overarching conversation. That conversation for me is summarized in what world order side are you on in 2020? Are you on the pre-World War II chaos side where anything goes? Or are you on the post-World War II rules-based world? And notice here, the rules-based world lines are not perfectly straight. The colors are not perfectly solid. There's problems in the rules-based world. Nonetheless, there is a rhyme and rhythm on how peoples and states are supposed to civilly interact with each other. If you are for a chaos world, the chaos ethos, in my opinion, accepts that God was a real estate agent. And at that point, I have nothing to discuss. Because like we have some people who are able to say that God is gave them a piece of property. By the way, we have some people on our side as well who say the exact same thing. People like me and the majority of the people, I think, on both sides, will be dealt out of the equation at that point. If you are for a rules-based ethos, then there are parameters to our activities, whether we like them or not. International law, in all its parts, guides us. And the three pillars of international law are the Charter of the United Nations, which we spoke about in the first slide, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the International Court of Justice, in addition to resolutions and conventions and treaties. All of these together are the way a civil world is supposed to interact. I would choose this. I want to move forward one step here and just show how has the Palestinian and the Israeli side dealt with these two differing views of the world. Interesting, both declarations of independence, and I won't read them here, but both declarations of independence, these are excerpts from the declarations, they both mention chaos period, and they both mention rules-based period. So kind of like both took out an insurance policy that they can reference either. The Palestinian side, however, went forward. The Palestinian Declaration of Independence happened in 1988. Palestinians went forward, and when the Oslo peace process collapsed in reality, Palestinians went back to the UN, where this started. And they told the UN, we failed to solve this conflict on a negotiation table. And Israel continues to build settlements, taking the exact land that this is supposed to be resolved for. So we asked the United Nations to recognize Palestine, the state. And in November 29, 2012, the General Assembly did that in Resolution 6719. It passed. On the right-hand side, you can see here, 138 countries said yes, 9 said no, I believe 41 abstained. The 9 are listed there. All of those superpowers basically blocked the international will of the community to move forward. This was an historic opportunity that was missed by Israel. This is a resolution where the Palestinians brought it themselves and placed it on the UN podium and basically said, we're going to accept, and remember, we already recognize the state of Israel, we are going to accept Palestine based on, and these are very important words, based on the 1967 lines. Why are those important words? If I was writing that resolution, I probably would have said on the 1967 lines. But the Palestinian leadership, being overly generous in trying to find a way out, said that we will deal with the western Palestinian border through negotiations. Long story here, but the Palestinians celebrated this. That chair in the background, it was a celebration that happened in every single Palestinian city. A chair of the UN with Palestine on it was a rallying call. The Palestinian people at that time were ready to say, let's move forward. Let's not go back to a chaos world. Israel refused, and the US as well, and we find ourselves where we are today. I believe that the question of one or two states, which comes up very frequently, is actually history. Thanks to the Palestinians and the majority of the world community, that has already been defined. On the left-hand side, the map, that's the map of the partition plan that actually everybody ignored. The right-hand side of the map is the map as identified with the West Bank and Gaza Strip in East Jerusalem being the state of Palestine, and the light brown part being the state of Israel. So diplomatically, not politically, diplomatically, the state of Palestine is a fact today, as is the state of Israel. So we're not talking about should there be one or two states, as if we're choosing something on a menu at a restaurant. Whether we like it or not, and I say this to Palestinians before anyone else, the political capital of accepting Palestine on 22% of historic Palestine has already been spent. What we're asking for now is the boot of Israeli military occupation to exit our state. And lastly here, the US basically produced maps in the Vision for Peace. On the left-hand side is Israel. On the right-hand side is so-called Palestine. Both of these don't look like a state, smell like a state, or taste like a state. Let's start with Israel on the left-hand side. If you look inside the green areas, which is supposed to be the Palestinian state, you'll see these circles with numbers in them. Those are supposedly Israeli settlements that will be part of the state of Israel. Does that look like a state of Israel that's sustainable? On the right-hand side is the state of Palestine in Trump's view. This is not a state any more than Swiss cheese is a solid chunk of cheese. And to end, I go back to make the case that what we're facing today is not new. Back in 2004, an Israeli newspaper quoted Dov Weisglass, who was a lawyer and an advisor to former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. And he basically said, we've been successful. We've created a talking point in the world which says there's no one to talk to. He called it a certificate. And he said that will only be revoked when Palestine becomes Finland. That's when the world needs to talk to the Palestinians. And then more recently, and this is sad beyond sad, the US ambassador to Israel very recently said that the Israelis don't have to live with the Palestinians state. Only when Palestinians become Canadians will they have to live with a Palestinian state. He understands very well that the plan that was presented by the US administration is not implementable in anybody's stretch of an imagination. And I end by just showing both of those gentlemen and everyone else these beautiful children in Gaza. And I confirm, and I'm willing to put money on the fact that these children and many more like them are not going to become Finnish and they're not going to become Canadians anytime soon. Thank you.
Sam, thank you for such an informative, just a spectacular presentation. That was incredible in terms of the volume of information and analysis. Very grateful. I always know Extend is going to get a great presentation and a great talk when we go to Sam Bahour, but that was even phenomenal by Sam Bahour standards. We've got a lot of questions flowing in, so I'm going to put mine on hold and let's just go right to the Q&A. So we've got one question that says, what does struggle on the ground by Palestinians entail? And if I can just add one thing to this, I really appreciate that you brought up the first intifada, because I think a lot of people hear that word and they think of the violence of the second intifada. And there's not that much focus or education on what did nonviolent civil disobedience look like in the first intifada. And one of the things that Extend is trying to do on the ground is bring people to communities who are still engaged in that sort of sustained nonviolent civil disobedience. And oftentimes it's for a particular communal concern, access to land or water. But we're talking about something larger than that, a national civil disobedience struggle. Can you talk to us a little bit about that context of the first intifada, and then what does it look like on the ground today?
Sure. What I would advise people to see, as was noted in the introduction, I'm a board member of Just Vision, which is a US organization in Washington, amazing organization, which produces documentaries on Palestine, Israel. And one of our last documentaries was called Naila and the Uprising. The public broadcasting system actually aired it. You can see live from the view of Palestinian women during the first Palestinian Intifada of what it looked like and what it meant by looking at that. But I would also note that I want to take the intifadas out of our lexicon for a second. Forget the first intifada and forget the second one, even though I'll get to it in a second. And I want to talk about 53 years of an ongoing military occupation for every aspect of our life. That means, just to give you a simple example, I'm an American citizen. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. I relocated here after the Oslo Accords because I was hoping that we were on track to build the state and end the occupation. For the first 15 or so years of being here, I used to drive an Israeli car because I'm here as a tourist. Israel doesn't allow me to be here any other way but as an American tourist. Until the time that I used to use the airport, for example, the Ben Gurion airport. Again, traveling around like any tourist. In 2009, Israel issued me a Palestinian residency card. And in my talks, I actually show the card. By issuing me the status of a Palestinian from the West Bank, this American citizen no longer was able to use the airport, had to sell my car and buy a Palestinian car because I wasn't allowed into Israel anymore or to drive an Israeli car. I'm now under the movement and access constraints that Israel applies to every Palestinian here. And that means for me to go from Ramallah, where I live in Al-Bire, a sister city of Ramallah, to go to Bethlehem, for example. Before, I used to just drive a straight line. I leave Ramallah, cross Jerusalem, and I'm in Bethlehem. On a Friday or a Saturday, it takes about 20 minutes. Today, I'm not allowed to go into Jerusalem. So I have to go up to the checkpoint, and then I go all the way down to the Jordan Valley and drive the whole Jordan Valley down to the Malay Adumim settlement, and then drive up to Bethlehem from the backside. That trip takes at best an hour and 45 minutes. That kind of disruption is an everyday disruption. There's 3 Israeli checkpoints, stationary ones, on the way. Any of them can hold us up for any amount of time. So as a business consultant today, I cannot tell my client in Bethlehem what time I'll be at the meeting. So for the last 10, 15 years, we've been telling people that we'll be there around 12 and 3. Can you run a business like that? You can't. That's just one example. The restriction of water to the Palestinian community is under full Israeli control. If you drive the Jordan Valley today, I can tell you which farms are Palestinian and which farms are settlements. The settlement ones are lush, green, beautiful. The Palestinian ones are barely making it because Israel controls the amount of water, which is livelihood here, in a very serious way. Last example I'll give, and these are outside the context of the Intifada. We do not have access to outside ports. There's no way you can reach me or products and goods can reach me unless they come through Israeli ports of entry. Same thing if I want to ship something out. Israel has full control over anything that comes in or goes out of this economy. And they use that by micromanaging what we can and we can't do. I actually came from the US to build the telecommunications company here, the first Palestinian telecommunications company. And I learned the very hard way that Israel maintains full control of the airwaves, which means it does not give Palestinians enough frequency to build a proper telecom network. We had to struggle for 12 years to get 3G here. 12 years, we only got it 2 years ago. And even at that, we only got it in the West Bank, not in Gaza. Whereas Israel has allowed all of their telecommunication companies to freely operate between the river and the sea, even in areas where they're not licensed to do so. Within that context, the disobedience here does not have to be violent. For me to get up in the morning and try to create a job is an act of nonviolent resistance. For a student to have to cross a checkpoint or to cross the wall openings to go to and from school, or a farmer to go to and from his farm, all of that together is nonviolent resistance. In the first Intifada, it made the news because it became nationwide and collective with a political leadership that actually articulated it in political terms. That's why the first Intifada was so crucial. It brought to the surface what basically Israel tried to bury for so many years, that this occupation exists. When we got to the second Intifada, actually I don't know why it's called an Intifada, because it's a very different set of activities. It was violent. The two sides were shooting at each other. And if you were like me, someone who doesn't shoot, you watched it on CNN and Jazeera, TV, just like I did from Ramallah. Those are two different acts. No one can actually predict that a third act of collective disobedience, whether it be nonviolent or violent, can be repeated. We're probably going to find something which is much more dangerous, and it's related to the slide where I talked about the loss of hope. We're seeing individuals, actually Israel's confirming what I'm saying. We are seeing individuals who are basically saying to themselves, this is not life. I equate life under occupation with death. So you're finding individual acts of violence, not politically motivated, motivated by a loss of hope. And that's what I see when I look at a Palestinian driver charging a checkpoint or trying to run over a soldier. Those are not political acts. Those are desperate acts of people who have been damaged because of 53 years of military occupation. What I would add, and I'll end here on this one, is that the upcoming resistance will have many shapes and forms. We've learned very well during the last 20 years what diplomatic resistance means. How do you create a state in the diplomatic community and ask other nations to recognize you, and then get membership? And then with that membership, go to the International Criminal Court and try to hold Israel accountable for the first time ever for its crimes against us. All of that and more will all be packaged together. What remains is to see, will there be a leadership that can articulate politically what is about to happen? Or will this be a fragmented set of activities that don't find political tracking? And on that, the answer is still not known.
Thanks, Sam. We're getting a number of questions flooding in here. A few people are asking about diplomatically how the Arab League and Jordan fit into this. Can you talk a little bit about that angle of this?
That's a very important question. When Trump and Kushner and Friedman were touting their plan, they were all excited that parts of the Arab world are aligned with them. They actually brought two representatives to the announcement at the White House. Once the plan was announced, the Arab League had an emergency meeting based on our request, Palestinians' request. Every single Arab state voted that they are totally against this vision that's been proposed by Trump. So the Arab world legislatively basically is totally aligned. Having said that, there are some countries which have become, from a normalization perspective, trying to get closer to Israel, partly because they fear the Trump administration. When you have a madman in the White House that's willing to turn on a dime on any issue, some of the states which basically are states which are Arab states, which are non-representative states. If we were in Central America, we'd be calling them banana republics. Here we can call them petroleum republics. They are countries which basically move based on US requests. So we're seeing the US try to act through these governments to show that the Arab world is divided. The Arab communities are not divided by any stretch of the imagination, no matter what individual acts specific countries could or will take. Having said that, the Arab League as a league, which is part of the UN, was very clear in condemning this act. Jordan is the sensitive one here. Jordan, which has the longest border with Israel, Jordan, which has a peace treaty with Israel, has basically announced through a statement of the king, I think it was on an interview with Der Spiegel in Germany, and basically said there will be significant and serious ramifications to any act of annexation today. And people are translating that to mean not only will that possibly be violence, but more politically oriented, it could be that it will damage or sever or cause a termination of the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement. If Israel takes note of anything in the Arab region, it's what's happening in Jordan. Because if Jordan's king and monarchy basically no longer are able to maintain some kind of normalcy as it relates to their border relationships with Israel, literally all hell will break loose on the Jordanian border. And that will be a different reality that I don't think anybody can actually define what it means today.
Thanks for that, Sam. We have a few people who are saying that, who are essentially drawing attention to the fact that in their part of the American Jewish community, these facts about the occupation, about Palestinian lived experience aren't recognized, or people just don't know. And someone is asking, what are resources that I can use to draw attention to these issues within my community?
That is an excellent question. As you know, Sam, I spend a lot of my time, I try to tell my wife I spend 70% of my time in business and 30% in politics. She tries to reverse the numbers. I spend a lot of my time engaging communities abroad, especially people coming here on trips. The bulk of that time is aimed towards the Jewish American community. And I've got deeply involved in many different organizations like Extend and Encounter, even J Street, in trying to articulate not only the Palestinian perspective, but more importantly, the facts on the ground. I honestly think if the facts on the ground are brought to the surface in a calm and analyzing kind of way, I don't have to force feed a Jewish audience to know that that's wrong. They will have all the tools in their tradition to know what's right and wrong. Because although I'm no expert on Judaism, I do know that social justice is one of its pillars. House demolitions is not Jewish. 53-year military occupation is not Jewish. Torturing people in prison is not Jewish. Imprisoning minors is not Jewish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not to mention uprooting olive trees, that's definitely not Jewish. So you have all of these facts that once Israelis see them, especially see them with their own eyes, and opening up happens in the mind and in the heart. We may still disagree politically, and that's okay. We're allowed to disagree politically. But while we're disagreeing politically, we must remain civil in our relationship with each other. And that's why I put in my slide that the world has rules, and those need to be followed while we're in a political debate. Where one can find information, there's plenty of places. I'll mention a couple. First and foremost, go on a trip with Extend or organizations like Extend. Actually come and see for yourself. That is the ultimate learning experience. Besides that, one needs to prepare even before a visit by reading and learning the other perspectives of what could be happening on the ground that you may not be aware of. I am a strong, strong believer that the entire Palestinian struggle and case can be made through Israeli and Jewish references. And on my blog, which is behind me here, epalestine.ps, you will find on the right-hand side bar a list of Israeli human rights organizations that will open your mind to what's happening on the ground. Not much more. They're not going to tell you what's right, one state, two state. They just tell you what's happening on the ground, especially what's happening in Gaza, especially what's happening in East Jerusalem, which is under supposedly Israeli full control, their capital. You'll be shocked to know on the ground how it's being dealt with. So that's one set of references. On my blog as well, you'll see that I frequently review books. I reviewed 2 books within the last COVID period here. One of them is from a Canadian professor, Professor Rabkin, and he wrote, What is Modern Israel? I highly recommend this book. You'll find the book review on my blog. Also, I read something to try to counter all of this negativity about we can't live together. There's a book by a friend of mine, Professor Menachem Klein. He's a professor in Jerusalem. And he wrote a book called Lives in Common. And he talks about pre-1948. How did these 2 communities live together? Highly recommended book. Highly recommended. Because there are those out there in the Jewish American establishment who want people to believe this all started in 1948. Or if they're generous, in 1939 when the Arabs revolted. What they don't want you to hear is that there was a cordial relationship between Jews, Muslims, and Christians long before the state of Israel was created. And what disrupted that basically was the introduction of Zionism into the equation, which is, as a political movement, had some political goals, and the rest is history.
Great. I'll also just, thanks for such a full answer on that. And I'll just briefly add a few resources. Of course, everyone should come on Extend, find a similar program. I think there's no substitute for seeing the reality for yourself. I think a lot of us in this work follow the Foundation for Middle East Peace's daily email. They have terrific resources broken down into Israeli politics, Palestinian politics, what's going on in the occupation. That's a highly recommended and regarded email list. And then follow independent media like 972, highly recommended as well.
Somebody reminded me now in the chat here. There's a new book out. It was just released during the COVID period, unfortunately, because I think it could have made even a larger hit, even though all the webinars that are happening may have promoted the book more than if the person would have ran around the world. It's Rashid Khaldi, Professor Rashid Khaldi. He wrote a book called 100 Years War on Palestine. So those people like me who are historically oriented as well would highly benefit from either looking up one of the talks that he's given online or reading the book, just to understand how Zionism actually did disfigure the relationship between the two sides.
Yeah, and Professor Halidi's work is, I think, anyone who wants to learn about the subject, and that's highly recommended. One other thing I'll add is that Extend has been hosting a number of these seminars. So if you want to continue learning through the COVID period, the next one I'll just mention is next Wednesday, June 3rd at noon. And we're going to have Mosi Raz, who is a member of the Israeli Knesset and a few years ago was the leader of the Meretz Party. So I'll post that in the sidebar. And for people who want to continue to learn, he'll be talking about the future of the Israeli left with annexation. Sam, we're getting a number of people who are asking about one state. How are Palestinians thinking about one state? You addressed how you're thinking about it in the presentation, but people are asking, particularly with younger people, what's the mood like? How is annexation impacting that?
That has, as I noted in my presentation, has gained much more prominence. It actually has been building over the years. The younger generation of Palestinians, remember, there's an entire generation here that was born after the Oslo Accords. They know nothing else except walls, checkpoints, settlements, and wars every few years on Gaza and elsewhere. That generation has watched the settlement enterprise grow at an exponential rate. And they're basically saying, rightfully so, that we are militarily weak. We're not able to stop the settlement enterprise. And sadly, the states of the world that are supposed to hold Israel accountable are not doing their jobs. So if we can't stop the settlement enterprise, then let's basically say, Israel, congratulations, you win. You get it all. You get Israel, you get the West Bank, you get West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, all the settlements, all the frequencies and airwaves, all the water. We'll throw in Gaza for free. And you know what else you get? Us. So basically, the younger generation is considering shifting this struggle in a structural way from a struggle which has articulated its self-determination via independence in a state, to shift away from that and basically say, we are going to resign to civil rights. Between the river and the sea, we want full equal rights. And that changes the entire calculus of this conflict. I will tell them not to hurry. I think we are very close to statehood. As you saw, there's only 9 countries blocking us from actually holding Israel accountable. And if you take out the 4 Pacific Islands, they're even less. We did not gain the majority of the world's recognition lightly. That came with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Now that we have the global recognition, now that we have observer status membership in the United Nations, just like the Holy See's recognition in the United Nations, just as we learned the game of international law and the law of occupation, just as we became experts in knowing our rights, all of a sudden people are saying, including the young generation, maybe without knowing that they're saying this, let's change the game. Let's change we were playing basketball, now let's play ping pong. And I tell them it will take us another 40 years to understand how to change the paradigm to a serious civil rights movement. And I say that mainly not because it's a wrong thinking, but just the opposite. I would hope one day Israel will be a different kind of Israel, where a single state could be a result of some kind of negotiation. But today, I know Israel well. I've studied the Israeli state, and they are not ready to accept a one-state solution with equal rights. They're saying it in public today. So what we will be doing is jumping out of the frying pan of a military occupation into the fire of apartheid full scale. And with today's leadership, I do not think that we have the leadership and patience and resources to be able to make that kind of a shift today, at least.
Well, Sam, thanks for that both very realistic and also hopeful point. And I think that what you're highlighting about how far the Palestinian national movement has come in this game of basketball, as you're defining it, I think is a point that often isn't emphasized. So I think on that hopeful, optimistic note, maybe that's where we'll close out. I really appreciate you making the time. Thanks, as always, for such a powerful briefing. Thanks to everyone who joined. You should highly recommend following Sam on, as you see in the corner, ePalestine.ps. And Sam writes very frequently, so get him up there on your frequently visited tabs and follow his thinking, which is always new and dynamic and impactful. And for those interested in future Extend programming, you can follow us on Facebook. Go to extendprograms.org. And as I posted in the group chat here, our next session is Wednesday with Mosi Raz. So Sam, thank you again for making the time to do this. And thanks to everyone for joining us.